Okay. My project, as you guys all know, is a production lookbook and prop development for a book to film adaptation of The Arrival by Shaun Tan. So part of the design problem here was creating a lookbook for film production. So when you're trying to get a film produced and you have an idea for a film, you present a lookbook to producers. This is before you even give them any kind of script or any other information about the film. So this is helping the producer to understand the film from an aesthetic position, and it can include anything from just images all the way through to like location information, camera information, the score. Like it can vary from very few details to super detailed. So this project is proposing an adaptation of the graphic novel The Arrival by Shaun Tan. So the focus with the props is on ephemera. So this is kind of the project planning and the timeline, which, you know, as everyone kind of talks about, it gets a little tight towards the end. But so we all kind of started here with just general sketching. This project was definitely inspired by a podcast that I listened to called 99% Invisible. And there was this particular episode where Annie Atkins was describing her experience as a graphic prop artist for movie sets. So part of my initial ideation for this project, with no other idea about really what I wanted to do, was just thinking about various things that I wanted to create, various items or ephemera. And a lot of my visual research came from a book that Annie Atkins had actually published, and it's called Designing Graphic Props for Filmmaking. She details in it a lot of the different kinds of props and the challenges that she faced creating props. So coming up with official, you know, government documents for a fake government, and all of these various like paper treatments that you can do with tea and signage and mail. So part of where my initial visual inspiration came from was vintage ephemera and vintage product design. So using the internet, Pinterest and everything, just kind of looking at various vintage ephemera, looking at color palettes, looking at fonts, looking at, you know, the print quality, all that kind of stuff. And from there, kind of drawing various color palettes out from things like these train tickets and posters and other sorts of tickets. I also looked into movie posters, even though that wasn't part of what I was going to be doing for this project, but just for more visual inspiration, especially movie posters from the time period. And as far as personas, I'll just kind of summarize these more generally. Like I said before, the lookbook is definitely more for a producer to be able to get an idea of like what the film is about before seeing a script, but it is also used as a resource for the director or the set designers or other prop designers, or even just the crew and cast, in order to reference some of the more aesthetic visions of a film. And then aside from that, the other audience that kind of comes into mind with prop design is when a film is viewed, the audience is far reaching and very wide. So hypothetically, if this had become a film, those props would be viewed by anyone watching the film. So beginning with kind of comparative research, I was looking at 3 different examples of graphic novels that had been adapted to film, kind of frame by frame. So this first one, Invention of Hugo Cabret, this is actually a personal favorite of mine. It's very similar in style to The Arrival. So it's a full black and white book with absolutely no words. And as you can see in the film adaptation, they really followed the frames very closely. And this is something that I ended up taking a lot of inspiration from later. The next example is Sin City. So again, very close following of the kind of frame by frame composition and, you know, some of those leading lines are definitely very telling of being able to follow that book very closely. And then finally is Persepolis. This is also one I read, I think, in high school or something, but this one not as closely tied in terms of frame by frame, but the style was very similar. So from there, coming up with the book that I wanted to adapt, my mom is a librarian, a teacher librarian, so she had a whole bunch of recommendations for me as far as children's books, and I was initially a little bit hesitant, but there's a lot to be done with adapting children's books. So I got really pulled in by this author and illustrator, Shaun Tan. So his imagery and a lot of the characters in his books are very otherworldly, to say the least. A lot of like just things that are kind of similar to what we see in our day-to-day life, but he introduces these like alien creatures and things where you're just like a little bit thrown off. So I was really drawn towards his style, and I came upon The Arrival by Shaun Tan. So this book is, first of all, beautiful. The illustrations range from anywhere from these like 2x2 squares to full page spreads. They're all sepia tone and black and white illustrations done in pencil, and they can get very, very detailed. So this book is only told through images. There are no words, discernible words at least, in the book at all. So the story itself is told just graphically. And kind of to briefly summarize the book, there's this family, the book kind of opens with this family that's living somewhere where their home is kind of surrounded by these very frightening creatures, and they're all metaphorical, but the dangers in their home country are very real. So what we see is our main character, the father of this family, moving and immigrating to this new country in order to kind of establish a better life for himself and his family before they come to meet him there. So the book covers his adjustment to this new place where he doesn't know the language, he doesn't understand really anything about this place, but he discovers that his community ends up being how he gets by. They all kind of help him to adjust. So again, this book doesn't really have any words in it. There are 6 sections, so I kind of went ahead and named those sections in order to kind of help understand thematically what happens in each section and how the sections flow. So first section, he leaves his home country and moves to this new place. The second section is his arrival, so coming through immigration and trying to get settled in. The third one is him getting to know his community a little bit, so getting to know some of his neighbors and fellow immigrants. The fourth section is him getting a job and trying really hard to get a job, and then finally gets a job at a factory. The fifth one is his family finally comes and reunites with him, and the sixth one is sort of just a brief like, hey, they made it and they're happy and they're safe. So moving on from there into the actual design process. So analyzing the book, there's a lot of very specific ephemera that push the story along. For example, when he's in the immigration center, he has to go through all these physical exams. And in the top left here, you can see there's these tags that get pinned to his shirt indicating that he's passed these exams. Other kind of things that push the story along are his book that helps him to translate various words, train tickets, posters. His identification paperwork is very important because that's part of what's indicating that he has made it, like that he has been able to move to this new place. And from there, there's the money. That's actually a really, really important element as far as indicating his ability to find success in this new place. There's other things like luggage tags and maps, newspapers, and then these last two, his apartment key, so indicating that he's been able to relocate and find a new place to live. And finally, this letter that he sends home with some money and an origami bird to entertain his daughter. So from there, just looking through the book and finding what the language was, that was a real challenge. Shaun Tan did not use any discernible language in this. He kind of just mishmashed a whole bunch of different languages together. So part of my challenge was figuring out how to make these ephemera with those characters in use. So I had to really analyze his use of form in the book and come up with fonts. So developing this alphabet, I started with the one on the left, the serif form. This was made with characters from Times New Roman and kind of squishing things together, smoothing things out, figuring out the weight, figuring out the height. I used the application Font Forge to actually create like a font that I could type in with this font that I made. And then from there, I developed a sans-serif font that's not specifically in the book, but was a very strictly geometric version of the serif. And then from there, this is just kind of those final character forms and kind of a visual comparison of each character from serif to sans-serif. And from there was the prop design. So looking at the various ephemera that kind of push the story along, there were quite a few different things that I wanted to tackle. So the first one being the immigration tags. For this, I ended up using actual colors from immigration cards from Ellis Island and Angel Island in order to create these immigration tags. So these were kind of the final designs. They featured these warm browns, warm yellows, this orange and the blue, and all of these indicated various exams that he had kind of passed. And this frame is compositionally similar to one of the frames in the book.
And so what we're seeing then with these props is we're seeing your photographs of the props in context.
Yes, yeah, this is the real photographs. Yeah, I actually have all of them here. I had to, print them out, figure out colors, because obviously with printing and printing colors in particular, there's a lot of things that are very different between screen and print. So that was a lot of trial and error. And then as far as just like roughing them up, getting the right kind of pins to pin them to my jacket, because the way in which they were shown being pinned to the clothes in the book, it wasn't like a safety pin, it was more of a straight pin. So I had to get the right pins. So from there, the next one I tried to tackle was the identification paperwork. This one, again, being a very important indicator of his being able to successfully relocate and make a better life for himself and his family. So initial sketches for it, the process really was just closely analyzing what was in the book and creating sketches based on that. The middle frame was kind of like figuring out, okay, alignment, composition, where are some of these elements going to go? And again, I really wanted to use real life examples of actual immigration paperwork. So these are all examples from Angel Island. And so I ended up using those colors. So initially, these are rough drafts. The initial draft on the left, there just wasn't enough on the page to make it look like a real document. So in the middle and on the right, I had printed the final draft onto colored paper and it just was not giving me the look that I wanted. So I ended up doing, again, color print tests and figuring out exactly what color I wanted to do. In addition, I also had to add handwritten elements. So I had to practice over and over and over again writing these fake characters, kind of like a crazy person, in order to really nail that like kind of speedily, quickly written character look, so that in the final document, I could get that look, that just really authentic look. So on the left is my photograph. Again, frame, one-to-one framing with the book. And again, roughening up the document, folding it a few times, just sort of beating it up a little bit to make it look like it really had been there. Next is the currency. So to kind of reiterate that, the currencies was super, super important to kind of pushing the story along, because that's part of why he's come, is to be able to make money and get his family over there as fast as possible. So the money was very vaguely drawn in the book. The illustrations were not very detailed, so I had a lot of room for experimentation and iteration within this. And I did a lot of research into currency design and various accessibility things with designing money. And I wanted to include a lot of imagery and various like motifs basically that you would see throughout the city. This sun shape being one, and then also on the right side you can see I started sketching those birds. Those birds are everywhere throughout the book. So this was kind of the initial draft of the design. Bottom left is just kind of an example of how I got a little bit too rough with trying to make the money look used and beat up. And then this was the final design with some of my photographs on the right. And these are the digital versions. So assigning characters to each of those values, having a distinct front and a back to the currency. And yeah, so next is the letter and stamps. So he's in this foreign country by himself. His family's still back home. So of course he's writing letters home. So part of this challenge was, again, handwriting the characters, handwriting his letter to his family. Something that he and his daughter do is they give each other little origami birds. So folding up the letter as an origami bird, just as he did in the book, and creating stamps. So the stamps, definitely trial and error there. On the left side, you can see one of my kind of experiments as far as creating perforations on the pages. So that was definitely trial and error and figuring out how to get it just right so that I could actually tear the page. And finally, this was the letter. So all folded up, putting the money in it, addressing the envelope, and obviously doing that with the handwriting and applying the stamp. And then this is second to last, and then we'll get on to the lookbook. So apartment key. He had an apartment that he got as soon as he got there. So creating that, modeling that, coming up with what kind of colors would go on that. He was in apartment A, so applying that label to the leather. I did that in Photoshop because I could not figure out how to do it in real life and have it look good. So that was where I ended up going with that, was just mocking it up in Photoshop.
So you drew the line at leather stamping.
Well, I tried. I definitely tried. Yeah, it just didn't, it wasn't giving me the effect that I wanted. And especially with just how crisp it is in the book, I knew that it needed to be that crisp in order to really get that across. So I ended up just going with Photoshop for that one. And then finally, the luggage tags. This was just something that I felt like throwing in as far as connecting his arrival with his family's arrival, because if they were both immigrating to the same place, then they would have the same luggage tag popping up on their luggage. So this was a draft that I had on the left side, some inspiration on the right, and then finally the luggage tag designs actually had some vintage whole reinforcers, so I ended up using those as far as doing that with the tags. And then last but not least is the lookbook. So as far as the lookbook, something to keep in mind here is lookbooks can vary greatly in terms of detail. And somewhere that I would like to take this project next is making the lookbook much more detailed. But this is what we've got for now. So the arrival lookbook. So initially, our story begins in the home of a family of three. Their surrounding environment is dangerous, full of these, really scaly, pokey creatures. But obviously they're metaphors for a much more real and significant danger to the family. And the father of the family immediately departs after a few pages of the book, and he's off to this new land. Part of his arrival is, he's arriving with all of these other refugees and immigrants. And part of his journey really involves these kind of hopeful shots, these very atmospheric shots of the sky, the birds, the ship, because this really is an exciting time. The music would be hopeful, bright, and building. You know, there's these shots of the overhead on the boat as he's arriving into this new place. These birds, as I mentioned before, that I included on the money, are this kind of repeating motif. Here we have our main character's luggage tags as he would be disembarking. Our main character is thrown into this bustling hall after departing from the ship. The hall is modeled after the Ellis Island Immigration Hall, and just some overhead shots of all of these people kind of packed together. And his examinations. So he's going through all of these kind of invasive exams, you know, where people are touching him, they're looking at him, they're really analyzing him. And it's a little bit frightening, but everybody's having to go through it. And in the end, he's really getting to where he's trying to go. So you can see along the bottom, he's kind of frustrated with not being able to understand what they're saying. And so part of the really expressive hand movements here are explaining what's going on, is explaining his frustration. So the exams and the immigration tags, his paperwork gets approved, so he gets that stamp of approval, and he keeps that very close to his chest where he can have it and identify himself. And he's thrown into this new and alien country all by himself. So really, he's isolated, he's kind of scared, but this place is beautiful. There's gorgeous architecture. There's all these people. There's bustling streets. There's all of this business, and just it's really stunning. And he's kind of in awe. And there's this air of hope and excitement and energy. And he's here to make a better life for himself and his family. So he's very eager to get his family there with him. So firstly, he gets his apartment. He is also very quickly learning that this place is not at all like home. There's a lot of animals and various other things that he really does not recognize and is not familiar with. So his key to his apartment, very, very important first step in his journey. Next is, you know, he kind of meets all these immigrants along the way, and all of these people have very similar stories to his in terms of being a refugee, making their way out of hardship and into a safer and more stable life for themselves. So he discovers this community where everyone's trying to help him adjust. This example has a father and son who are helping him figure out the food because he's just trying to find some bread, and they're like, no, you should try this. So they end up inviting him to dinner. And here's some seed pods that actually work really well as a form study for the foods, as far as just sort of these unrecognizable shapes, but are naturally occurring. And obviously, as I've said before, the money is a really, really important icon throughout this journey, because it's really representative of how he's making his life better for himself and his family. And he's writing letters back home where, you know, our main character, he's putting that money in there, getting it home and sending it off to his family. And then eventually they're coming to meet him in this new place. And it ends with this really beautiful overhead shot of them dramatically reuniting in a field with the birds flying by. So yeah, room for expansion here is probably going to be the lookbook and coming up with ways in which to make that more detailed and more, because that can range anywhere from just like a book full of images to a book with full on, like, here's the score, here's the location, here's the, you know, camera angles. Like, they can get really, really detailed. So I was aiming for detailed, but not like on that level, because I don't really know where I would want to shoot this, but yeah.
You know, it actually is really strong as a standalone piece. So I guess, yes, you could start to add that additional detail, but it's actually, it's really just stunning. Like, yeah, it's really great, Lauren. Yeah. Oh, bye, Dory. Actually, it's kind of too bad that Dorian had to run, because the similarity between your project and Dorian's project is that both of them are kind of a love letter to their subject matter. And he had even titled his piece, was anybody there for his presentation? It's like it's a French word for love letter. It's a boulet doux or something, or it was, I don't know French. I really, so bad. One of my many personal failings. Anyway, it's just, it is really just totally stunning, Lauren. And I can think of little to nothing that I would change about what you did there. Maybe I can just share some observations about some of the things that I thought were really important that you evidenced in that. So one of the things that, I think design is observation. That is just what it is. And what we do is we observe things, and then we make things in response to what we observe. And you brought this really intense focus to this book and observed all of those details. And then by thinking about how this was going to translate into film, after like rigorously identifying the patterns from the book, after mapping out that narrative arc, after identifying the artifacts that drove that narrative. So this is like already, so it's this meticulous kind of observation that you did. Then to take that into a film space, to imagine how that might come out there, then you had to make these decisions about how that would translate. And it's a sort of, it's a hard pivot for us to do as designers, where we have to observe things relentlessly. And it sort of like puts us in this mindset where we have to be very, very faithful to the form. But then when you actually had to execute on it, you had to make a number of decisions, right? So you had to make a number of decisions about how that whole alphabet would look. You had to make decisions about color, because we went from a black and white format to a color format. What were some of the other things on my list? You had to make decisions about materials. You had, I think that you handled that in such a nuanced way. I'm just super impressed with the way you did that. So very, very, very faithfully documented what you saw, and then took that and made these subtle decisions that sort of honored the source, but also let us expand out on the source. I mean, this is what homage is. This is what we talk. All right, I'm going to do it one more time, a reference to visual design literacy. But when we talk about pastiche, pastiche is a love letter. It's where we copy something that exists in the world, but then we take it and we expand out that conversation. And you just did that beautifully. Would everyone agree with me that this is very obviously a labor of love? Yeah.
1,000%.
What's that?
1,000%.
1,000%. I mean, it's really stunning, isn't it, Clinton? Yeah.
Blown away. I mean, it's remarkable. Like you can
almost as stunning as your bright teeth and clear skin. Sorry. Oh, I just had to a little bit. Yeah.
I can talk again. But yeah, I mean, like you took us into this other world that story was purely visual, but you interpreted it in such a way that you had to fill in some of those gaps, and whether or not you captured what the author intended you intended in that book, or if you left it open in interpretation on purpose. I mean, like, you can't help but be in love with the version that you created, visually, storyline, hope, like that dream of a better life. Like, I don't know, I want to see this movie. I really do. And
I do too.
it's so impressive. Like, you created an alphabet. Like, who does that? Like, I don't know. I've always wanted to get into fonts and like venture into creating a font. I think it just seems like fun.
Yeah, but creating a font is one thing. Creating an alphabet is a whole nother thing. And she actually did both of those.
Yeah. That's what I mean. It's like, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around everything I just saw. But
well, can I actually want to speak to something you said there real quick before we lose the thread on this, is that you talked about it as a visual experience. But one thing that I noted as I was sort of listing out some of the things that you evidenced here is that, yes, you had to figure out the visual language of all of those artifacts, but then additionally, you had all of these other criteria that you had to consider too, which were patterns of use. So thinking about what kind of pin that you use and kind of how that attaches, that is a pattern of use. Thinking about where you would see distress on the documents or on the currency, that is a pattern of use. Again, materials. You also had to think about context cues. So I thought the way that you use the model and the model's clothing as additional context cues for the artifacts was really brilliant. And so yes, it's all visual, but there are all of these other categories that Lauren was attending to in that visualization. And expertly. I mean, you did it in like such a subtle way that, you know, if we weren't looking at it in this forum where, you know, we're really scrutinizing that work, we would just get carried along with the effortlessness of that. To Clinton's point about wanting to see the movie, right? It kind of felt like, ooh, it's the trailer for the movie, right? Because everything had that seamless quality, and it's such a huge accomplishment. Hold on, let me just look at there are a couple other important things I just want to hit on before I kind of let the structure of the feedback go. So, okay. One other thing that I thought was really important, that I think you've shown me the book a couple of times and talked about how you were identifying those visual cues. But one thing that I picked up on in the book for the first time was the way the flora and the fauna all have an exotic quality. So the animals look kind of strange. The plants look a little bit strange. And it's a very interesting way, because the people all look pretty normal. I mean, they look like they're from a different period. It's funny because like the architecture is a little, this style of theme has come up in a couple of projects too, including Dorian's. So too bad he's not here for this, but is that there's a kind of retrofuturism. So you get some of that retrofuturism in the architecture. But, you know, basically the buildings look like buildings, and the people dress like we would expect people to dress, even if maybe more formal and from a different era. But like the plants and the animals are just kind of weird and novel. And it's a very interesting way to capture the discomfort of being in a foreign place while you continue to act normal and try to move through the world in a way that's expected. And that you were then able to, again, photographically, I thought the images that you were able to pull to represent that architecture were excellent. The way you were able to represent the palettes in that photography was excellent. And then kind of the real kicker for me was getting all of those funny seed and pod forms and things like that had that alien quality that was in the book. And I just thought, to be able to bring those in as natural objects, these natural, unnatural objects at the end, really captured something that was essential to the book, which was expressing that foreignness and that discomfort through the unusualness of the flora and the fauna. So that was kind of my last little idea takeaway that I picked up from what you were doing. It's totally stunning. It was just, I mean, I think you should just be so incredibly pleased with what you were able to accomplish with it.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy about it.
Yeah. And, you know, it's sort of funny. Believe it or not, I actually worry about all your projects all semester long. You guys take up a lot of my headspace during a semester. And it's kind of funny doing the 505 because it's so many different projects, and it's like me like trying to track so many different projects at the same time. And I worry about them. And Lauren, I think this is the first time you and I have been in class together, right?
We had one of whatever the intro one is that you teach. I think I was.
Oh, you were in the visual design literacy.
Yes.
Okay. You were in that big lecture class, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, like I just wasn't really familiar with your work and your working style, and you had this kind of wacky idea and it sounded really lovely and charming. And, you know, believe it or not, like if I'm familiar with your work and I kind of know how you go about it and I kind of know the sorts of things that you do, like a lot of my questions will be sort of in line with some things that I know about you and the kind of work that you do. I didn't know those things about you. And so it was like a little scary for me because I was like, oh, this could be a really cool project, but it could really bomb too, you know? And so it was, were there any tells when we were in those early conversations?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, just as far as like your experience previously with people who didn't finish their projects. And I know early on you were worried about the scope of my project as far as me actually finishing it. So
yeah. Yeah. So, you know, I think that when we get into this class, you know, everybody's taking really big risks with these projects.
I think it's really funny that you say that, Deborah, because I've actually had Lauren in a lot of my classes, so I've seen her work style. So she said her prompt and I was like, oh my goodness, that's perfect for Lauren. Like she thought of the most perfect project for her work style and stuff. So I thought that was really interesting that you mentioned that, because when she said it to me, I was like,
yeah, oh, you knew. Yeah, well, I wish you would have told me, Claire. I would have worried a little bit less. So anyway, it's just, but almost because I was a little bit scared on the front end, it's almost even that more delightful to see it now. It would have spoiled the fun. You're right, Roby. Exactly. Exactly. See, I stress you guys out all semester, but I guess you guys have to keep me on my toes too, right? You have to keep me a little bit stressed too, and then the rewards are higher at the end. It goes both ways, right? Yeah. Here, I'm going to stop recording here. Inside. Stop. There we go.